I was already sitting across from this blind Mafia boss before I fully understood how I had gotten there. 48 hours ago, I was asleep in my apartment, dreaming about nothing, living the ordinary, quiet life I had carefully constructed for myself and Marcus. Then my phone rang at 2 a.m., and everything I had built came apart in a single conversation. Marcus was gone. Not missing, not lost, taken. And the man sitting across from me right now, still composed, expensive suit, dark glasses, hands folded on the desk like we were about to discuss quarterly earnings. He was connected to why? Not because he took Marcus, because someone who wanted to destroy him did. His name was Kim Jae-won, 30 years old, head of the most feared syndicate in the city, and he was blind. I knew that before I walked in. What I did not know, what nobody warned me about, was that being in the same room as him would feel like being read. He hadn't looked at me once. He couldn't. But from the moment I sat down, he had been doing something that felt far more invasive than looking. Like he was taking inventory of me through the air between us. "You're nervous," he said. "I'm fine." "Your breathing changed when I sat down. You've shifted in your seat 3 times, and you've been oriented toward the door since you walked in." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm blind, Miss Carter, not unaware." I said nothing. There was nothing intelligent to say to that. The Park faction had come for me 2 days after Marcus disappeared, when their leader sat across from me in a car that smelled like leather and old cigarettes and explained the arrangement with the calm of someone who had made this kind of offer before, and always gotten the answer he wanted. Marcus had stolen from them, not a little, enough to matter, enough that by their rules they had every right to do whatever they wanted with him. But they were generous men, he said. 30 days. All I had to do was get inside Jae-won's organization, get close and report back. His movements, his meetings, his vulnerabilities, anything useful. At the end of 30 days, Marcus would come home and I would walk away and this would be finished. I asked what happened if I said no. He looked at me the way people look at a question they find almost charming in its innocence. I didn't say no, so there I was. Sitting across from Kim Jae-won in an office that cost more than my entire apartment building, giving him careful answers to careful questions while he sat perfectly still and listened like he was hearing more than I was saying. The interview lasted 20 minutes, professional, precise, controlled on both sides, but the entire time I had the unnerving sensation of being in a room where the walls were paying attention. At the end, he stood and extended his hand toward me with an accuracy that sent a quick cold shock through my chest. I shook it. Monday, 7 a.m. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel deliberate. "Don't rehearse anything over the weekend, Miss Carter. It won't help." I walked into the hallway and stood there for 30 seconds before my legs remembered what they were for. I told myself it was just nerves. First day jitters before an assignment I hadn't chosen. I told myself I was fine. I told myself a lot of things that weekend. Monday arrived faster than I was ready for. I showed up at 7 exactly, composed, prepared, and was completely wrong about what I was walking into within the first hour. This was not a desk job with comfortable distance built into it. There was no corner to observe from, no professional boundary that created breathing room between us. I was with him through everything. His home, his meals, his meetings, his entire day laid out in front of me with nowhere to step back from. Total proximity. The Park faction had called it an assistant position. What it actually was the closest I had ever been to anyone I was trying to gather information on, and it was already harder than I had calculated. I watched him move through his world that first week, and I want to be honest about what it did to my assumptions because it matters to everything that came after. I had constructed a version of this man in my head before I arrived, someone whose blindness was a crack in the foundation, a place where the careful architecture of fear he had built around himself showed its weakness. I had told myself that was the advantage I would use. I was wrong about almost everything. He navigated his own space with the ease of someone who had long ago stopped grieving what he lost and simply rebuilt on different terms. His office, his home, every environment he controlled was arranged with a precision that looked minimal, but was deeply intentional. Everything exactly where his hands expected it. He never reached twice for anything. When in a meeting that first week, I watched him catch a lie I didn't even register. A business partner was 3 sentences into an explanation when Jae-won went very still. His head tilted a fraction. Then he asked one question, one quiet, precise question that unraveled the man's entire position, like pulling a single thread from a sweater. The room temperature dropped. The partner's face went the particular white of someone who has just understood they are in serious trouble. I sat in the corner with my notepad and recalibrated everything. This was not a man with a weakness I could find and use. This was a man who had turned limitation into something that looked disturbingly like a superpower. Then came the evening I planted the listening device. I had waited for the right moment all day, late enough that the building was quiet. And he was standing at the window with his back to me, completely still, a phone call finished, just standing there the way he sometimes did, like he was watching something even though he couldn't see anything. I moved to his desk, slow, careful. I crouched slightly and pressed the small device to the underside of the desk edge and held it there while the adhesive set. He didn't move, didn't turn, didn't react at all. I straightened up, walked out, and made it to the elevator before I exhaled. I drove home and filed a thin, useless report to Park and told myself next week would be easier. 2 weeks in, and the routine between us had become something I hadn't planned for. Not dramatic, not obvious, just the quiet accumulation of proximity doing what proximity does when you are not careful enough to stop it. I knew how he took his coffee by the 3rd day without being told again. I knew which silences meant he was thinking and which meant the conversation was finished. I knew the particular stillness that meant he was actually listening versus the polite performance of it that most people never bother to distinguish between. He asked me one afternoon to describe a photograph in a file he was reviewing. I described it plainly, completely, every relevant detail without softening or editorializing. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. "You describe things the way they actually are," he said. "Most people add something, like they're protecting me from information I asked for." He said it without bitterness, just as an observation. But it landed somewhere it had no business landing, and I sat with that for the rest of the day without fully understanding why. Then came the letter. An enemy sent a written message to his office. I could tell from the envelope before I opened it that it wasn't a business communication. The handwriting was too deliberate, the kind of careful that means someone chose every word to cause maximum damage. I opened it and read the first paragraph aloud and stopped. It was designed to humiliate him, specific and surgical in the way only personal hatred can be. It went straight for his blindness like a blade that had been sharpened for exactly that purpose. "Continue," he said. "No. I'm sorry? I'm not going to finish it." I set it down on the desk. He wrote this because he wants you to feel something. He wants to know he got to you. And I'm not going to be the instrument of that. The silence that followed was the longest I had ever sat inside. I could not read his face. I could never fully read his face, and in that moment I felt the full weight of that. Then he said, "Pull up my afternoon schedule." That was all. The letter was never mentioned again, but I noticed something in that moment that I didn't know what to do with. When I set the letter down and looked up at him, he was already facing me. Not toward my voice, not toward the sound of the paper. His face was pointed directly at mine with a precision that had nothing to do with sound because I hadn't made any. Like he had been watching my expression the entire time I was reading. I felt a sudden strange flush of self-consciousness, like someone had caught me in something private. Then I shook it off. Or he turned his face toward people when he addressed them. That was something blind people did, oriented toward the person they were talking to. That was all it was. I drove home that night with the feeling sitting quietly in the back of my mind, like something I had put down but not yet let go of. Park called, demanded more. I gave them almost nothing and ended the call before they finished talking. Somewhere in the third week, I made a decision. I told myself it was professional, practical, that I had gotten too comfortable, too close, and comfort was dangerous in a job like this. I needed to reset, create some distance, remind myself what I was actually here to do. So I did. I became cooler, more clipped in my responses. I stopped the small moments. The coffee I had started making without being asked. The way I had begun to anticipate what he needed before he asked for it. I pulled back, deliberately, cleanly. He noticed within a day. Of course he did. He didn't ask about it. He simply adjusted, matched my formality with his own, gave me the professional distance I was creating, let me have the space I was pretending to need. And that was somehow worse. I had expected him to push back, to ask what was wrong or fill the silence with something. Instead, he just quietly accommodated my retreat like a man who had been accommodating people's discomfort with him his entire life and had stopped expecting anything different. By the third day, I was making his coffee again. I didn't acknowledge it. Neither did he. But when I set the cup on his desk that morning, he said, without looking up from the document he was having read to him, "Thank you, Miss Carter." 2 words, quiet, like he was thanking me for something larger than coffee. I sat down at my desk across the room and looked at my own hands and understood with complete clarity that the distance I had tried to build was already gone and had probably never been real to begin with. I was in serious trouble, and it had nothing to do with Park anymore. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, and it was such a small thing that I almost let it go. We were working through a contract at his desk, documents spread between us. I had stood up to retrieve a file from the cabinet behind me, and when I turned back around, he was looking at me. Not toward me. Not in my general direction. At me. On his face was angled with a precision that had nothing to do with sound because I hadn't made any. I'd moved quietly, turned around quietly, and found his face pointed directly at mine, like a compass finding north. I stood there for a moment. He said, "Did you find it?" "Yes," I said, and I sat back down and opened the file and said nothing. But something had shifted in me that I couldn't push back down this time. I sat across from him for the rest of that hour and turned things over quietly in my mind one by one. The window the first week when his head angled toward me in silence, the letter when his face was already on mine before I looked up, and now this. I told myself there were explanations. There were always explanations. He was extraordinarily attuned to his environment, but a sound you didn't make cannot be heard. And I filed it away in a place I kept locked and went home and lay on my back staring at the ceiling for a long time. Something was not adding up, and I didn't know yet what to do with that. If this story has you hooked, hit the like button right now and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop in the comments, do you think Solène is starting to figure it out? Tell me what you think is going on. That same week, Park made their move, an attack on one of Jae-won's operations. The aftermath was immediate and tense, and when the question of how information leaked started moving around the room, it moved in my direction. His lieutenant wanted me removed, stood in the middle of a room full of people, and made the case for why I was the liability. Every eye in that room found me. Or I sat very still and kept my face neutral and felt the specific cold loneliness of being expendable to everyone present. Jae-won shut it down, publicly, clearly, with a finality that left no space for argument. He put himself between me and that room, without hesitation and without explanation. Afterward, alone in his office, I asked him why. Because it wasn't you. You can't know that for certain. Miss Carter. Something in his voice shifted. I know exactly that. I drove home in complete silence and sat in my parked car outside my building for a long time. The man I had been sent to gather information on had just protected me from consequences I actually deserved. And the worst part was that it didn't feel like strategy. It felt like he meant it. When the beginning of the end started on a Tuesday evening that looked like nothing from the outside. We were in a car, stuck waiting during a long delay outside an external meeting. The silence between us had long since stopped being uncomfortable. Somewhere in 3 weeks, it had become the kind of silence two people share when they no longer feel the need to fill space with noise. I started describing the street outside without thinking about it. What people were wearing. A child losing a battle with an ice cream cone. 2 older men at the corner arguing about something they had clearly been arguing about for decades and intended to argue about for decades more. I was just filling the silence. He went completely still beside me. Eyes closed. I noticed that specifically because I was watching him more carefully now. Eyes closed. Head tilted back slightly. The expression on his face something I had never seen before. Unguarded and quiet, and younger than he ever looked in a room where other people could see him. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then, tomorrow, on the drive-in. That was all. I turned back to the window so he couldn't hear whatever was happening to my breathing. That night, Marcus called. His voice was tight. Park had moved him to a different location, and he didn't know where he was. The deadline was 4 days away. I told him I was handling it. I told him to stay calm. I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and let myself feel the full weight of where I was. I went back to the office late that night to get something I had left behind. He was still there, and we ended up talking for nearly 2 hours. Not about work, about before. What we wanted, what we gave up, what we missed. He told me the loneliest part of his life was not his blindness. It was that he had built a world where no one around him was permitted to be fully honest with him. Everyone had an agenda. Everyone managed him. No one simply told him the truth because the truth was dangerous, and he was more dangerous than the truth. I built it that way on purpose, he said. I understand why it's necessary. A pause. That doesn't make it less lonely. I sat across from him at midnight, and those words went through me like something cold and clarifying. He was describing exactly what I was doing to him, down to the precise detail, and then he did it again. We had been sitting in comfortable silence, both of us somewhere in our own thoughts. I was looking at him the way you look at someone when you think they cannot see you doing it, taking in his face without the performance of not staring. And he turned and looked back, not adjusted, not oriented, looked directly at my face, with a steadiness that lasted 2 full seconds before he turned away. My breath caught. I said nothing. He said nothing. The silence continued like nothing had happened. I drove home and did not sleep. This time I laid every moment out in my mind in a line. The window, the letter, the file cabinet. Tonight, 4 moments. 4 times his face found something it should not have been able to find in the dark. I did not have a conclusion yet, but I had a question that was no longer going away. Park's final call came the next morning, 48 hours. One real piece of information or the situation with Marcus would change permanently. I spent the next day at work moving through everything normally, made his coffee, read his correspondence, sat across from him in a meeting, and translated a document without letting my voice betray a single thing. He gave me space without asking why I needed it, and that quiet consideration, the way he always seemed to know without being told, nearly unraveled me completely. I got what Park needed that afternoon. I drove to the drop point as the sun went down, parked across the street, turned the engine off, and sat there. Outside the window, the city moved the way it always did, indifferent and ordinary, and completely unaware that I was sitting in a car trying to decide who I was. A woman on the pavement was laughing at something on her phone, and a man was buying flowers from a corner stall. Somewhere behind me, a child was being called home for dinner. Normal life, happening 10 feet away while I sat inside a choice that felt like it weighed more than I did. I thought about a man who said nobody had ever told him the truth. I thought about a letter I refused to finish reading. I thought about coffee made without being asked, and silence that had stopped feeling empty, and the particular way he went still when I described the city like it was something worth describing. I thought about who I had been when I walked into that office 30 days ago, and who I was sitting in this car right now, and whether those two people would recognize each other. I thought about Marcus, my brother, the whole reason I was here, the person I had crossed every line for. And then I thought about the fact that I had not heard his voice in 4 days, that Park had moved him and cut the line, and the only leverage they had left over me was a threat I could no longer verify. Something cold and clarifying moved through me. I started the engine. I drove away from the drop point and did not look back, and for the first time in 30 days, I felt like I could breathe all the way down. I called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring. Safe. Confused about where he was, but safe and whole, and his voice was the most solid thing in the world. He read me an address slowly. I didn't recognize it. It was nowhere near any park location I knew. I stared at the road ahead and breathed. Then I drove back to the office, walked in, closed the door, and told him everything. From the night Marcus was taken, and the meeting in the car, the 30 days, every report I filed, every careful omission, every lie told through what I chose not to say. My voice was completely steady. My hands were not. I stood in the middle of that office and handed him every weapon he needed and did not look away once. He let me finish completely. The silence afterward was enormous. Then, Marcus has been safe for 11 days. When I confirmed who sent you, I had him moved. Park had no idea. As far as they knew, the threat was still alive, which meant you kept working, kept feeding them information I could control, and I kept watching what you chose to tell them. A pause. Park was never going to release him regardless of what you delivered. That was never the real arrangement. You were always meant to be a loose end. The room tilted. 11 days. Marcus had been safe for 11 days while Park kept calling me with deadlines and threats, and I had been carrying it alone for nothing. They had kept the lie alive because a desperate person is a useful person, and I had been exactly that, useful and desperate and completely in the dark. The relief and the fury arrived at exactly the same moment, and I let both of them move through me at full volume. You moved him and said nothing to me, I said. You let me keep believing he was in danger. Yes, for 11 days. Yes. His voice was even, not apologetic, not cold either, just honest. I needed to know what you would choose when the cost of stopping was still real to you, when you still believed you were risking something by walking away. He paused. If I told you Marcus was safe, you would have stopped out of relief. I needed to know if you would stop for a different reason. I looked at him across the office. And? You parked outside that drop point for 19 minutes and drove away. I stared at him. You had someone watching me. I had someone watching the drop point. Yes. The park situation closed within the week. Jae-won had been building a case against them long before I arrived, documenting, collecting, waiting for the moment their overreach gave him everything he needed. When it ended completely. The kind of ending that left no loose threads and required no sequel. One clean, decisive action, and the park faction stopped being a problem in any direction. I won't pretend I wasn't relieved. What I want to tell you about is 3 weeks later. His apartment, evening. And I brought food from a place I had described to him once on a long drive, because he had asked me what my favorite restaurant was. With the same focused attention, he gave everything, and I had answered without thinking, and apparently he had filed it away in that memory of his that forgot nothing. He opened the door before I knocked. He had heard me coming down the hall, or so I assumed. We ate. We talked. Easy in the way that things built slowly and through difficulty eventually become easy. At some point, the conversation went quiet in the comfortable way it did between us now. I was looking at him across the table, and he was looking back. And there it was again. That feeling. That specific feeling of being seen by someone who was not supposed to be able to see me. I set down my chopsticks. I have to ask you something. He waited. I need you to tell me the truth. When haven't I? He said quietly. I looked at him for a long moment, at those dark glasses, at the face I had spent 30 days sitting across from, learning, cataloging, falling for without permission. Can you see me? The silence was different from all the other silences between us. Fuller, like something that had been held for a long time, finally being set down carefully. He reached up slowly and removed his glasses. His eyes were dark and still and looking directly into mine. Not the way you mean, he said. Shapes, light, outlines at close range, movement in my peripheral, shadows where people are. He paused. Enough. Enough. I sat with that word, turned it over, laid everything out against it one more time. A shape crouching at his desk the night I planted the device. A face turning toward mine before a sound was made. A man at a window who was not simply standing there. The listening device, I said. I saw you, and you let me. I wanted to know what you would send them. The smallest pause. You sent them almost nothing. I looked at him across the dinner table. This man who had built his entire world around never being deceived and had let me stay inside it anyway. Who had watched me from the beginning with more clarity than I had watched myself. Everyone shows you everything, I said slowly, when they think you cannot see them. Yes. So what did you see when you were watching me? He was quiet for a moment, unhurried, the way he always was when the answer actually mattered. Someone who kept stopping, he said. Every time you had a reason to go further, you stopped. Are the reports, the device, the drop point. His hands rested open on the table between us. I watched you choose differently over and over before you understood yourself why you were doing it. I think I knew before you did. I looked at this man, 30 years old, the most carefully guarded person I had ever met, sitting across a dinner table with his glasses off and his eyes on mine and nothing hidden. The letter, I said, that was when it changed for you. You told me it wasn't worth my time. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the thing that existed in him just before one. In 6 years, no one had said that to me. Like my dignity was worth protecting without being asked. I reached across the table, not quite to his hand, halfway. And the way you reach when you are offering something and leaving the decision to the other person. He looked down at my hand in the particular way he looked at things, taking in what he could, filling in the rest with everything else he had spent 30 days learning about me. Then he reached the rest of the way across and took it. He held it like a decision he had made before I knocked on his door. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Leave a comment telling me the exact moment you suspected he could actually see. I want to know when you figured it out. And if you know someone who needs a story about being truly seen, share this with them right now. Thank you for staying until the end.